The rich child drew something so disturbing that he cried silently and said nothing to his father. Only the housekeeper understood the meaning. The Long Island mansion stood like a fortress of old money privilege, its Georgian colonial architecture commanding respect from anyone who dared approach its wrought iron gates. Manicured hedges lined the circular driveway, where a black Mercedes S-Class sat gleaming under the October afternoon sun. Inside, the silence was deafening, the kind of quiet that money could buy, insulating its inhabitants from the chaos of the outside world. Maria Gonzalez pushed her cleaning cart down the marble hallway, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound on the polished floors. At 45, she carried herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to make herself invisible in spaces where she didn't belong. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her grey uniform was pressed to perfection, a requirement in the Hampton household where appearances mattered more than comfort. 3 months. That's how long she'd been working for the Hampton family, and she was still adjusting to the suffocating atmosphere of wealth and expectation. The job paid well, better than anything she could find after fleeing her abusive ex-husband in Queens, but something about this house made her skin crawl. Maybe it was the way conversation stopped when she entered a room, or how the staff moved through the mansion like ghosts, each person locked in their own sphere of responsibility. "Mrs. Gonzalez," came a sharp voice from behind her. Maria turned to see Mrs. Whitfield, the head housekeeper, approaching with her trademark disapproving frown. The older woman had worked for the Hamptons for 15 years and guarded her territory with the fierceness of a prison warden. "Mr. Hampton expects the boys' room to be spotless before his business associates arrive this evening," Mrs. Whitfield said, her Boston accent cutting through the air like broken glass. "And make sure you don't disturb anything on his desk. The child has particular arrangements." Maria nodded, understanding the unspoken rule. Don't ask questions, don't get involved, just clean and disappear. She'd learned that lesson the hard way during her first week when she'd tried to comfort 7-year-old Benjamin Hampton after finding him crying in the library. Mrs. Whitfield had made it clear that emotional support wasn't part of her job description. The boys' bedroom was on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway lined with oil paintings of stern-faced Hampton ancestors. As Maria approached the heavy oak door, she could hear muffled sounds from within, not crying exactly, but something close to it. She knocked gently. "Benjamin?" "It's Maria. I need to clean your room, sweetheart." Silence. Then the sound of papers rustling frantically, followed by tiny footsteps running across the hardwood floor. Maria waited a moment before using her master key to enter. The room was a study in contrasts. Expensive toys, remote-controlled helicopters, a train set that probably cost more than Maria's monthly salary, shelves lined with leather-bound books, sat untouched, gathering dust. But in the corner, hunched over a small desk, was Benjamin Hampton, his blonde hair falling into his eyes as he furiously scribbled with a black crayon. "Hey there, honey," Maria said softly, her maternal instincts overriding the house rules. "What are you working on?" Benjamin's small body tensed. He was pale and thin for a 7-year-old, with dark circles under his blue eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. His expensive polo shirt hung loose on his frame, and his hands trembled slightly as he quickly gathered his drawings and shoved them into his desk drawer. "Nothing," he whispered, his voice barely audible. It was the first word Maria had heard him speak in weeks. She began dusting the bookshelf, keeping one eye on the boy. Benjamin sat perfectly still now, his hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing. This wasn't normal behavior for a child, especially one with access to every privilege money could buy. In her previous jobs, cleaning houses in middle-class neighborhoods, she'd seen plenty of kids Benjamin's age. They were loud, messy, full of energy and questions. This child was like a little ghost, haunting his own life. As Maria worked, she noticed things that others might miss. The expensive toys showed no signs of use. The bed was made with military precision, too perfect for a 7-year-old to have done alone. and there were faint marks on the wall near the desk, as if something had been taped there repeatedly and torn down. "Your daddy's having some important people over tonight," Maria said conversationally, hoping to draw the boy out. "Are you excited to meet them?" Benjamin's shoulders hunched forward, and he shook his head almost imperceptibly. The reaction was so swift and instinctive that it made Maria's heart clench. She'd seen that same defensive posture in the mirror during her own childhood, and later in the final months with her ex-husband. "Well, maybe you'll get to stay up past your bedtime," she continued gently, moving to vacuum the carpet. As she worked around the desk, something caught her eye in the small wastebasket beside it. Crumpled papers, at least a dozen of them, all covered in what looked like frantic scribbling. Without thinking, she reached for one, smoothing it out carefully. The drawing was crude, done in black crayon with violent, angry strokes. But as Maria studied it, her blood began to run cold. Two stick figures dominated the page, one large, one small. The larger figure loomed over the smaller one, in a way that made Maria's stomach turn. Around the edges of the paper, smaller figures watched from doorways, their faces turned away. "Benjamin," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The boy looked up sharply, his eyes wide with terror when he saw what she held. In one swift movement, he lunged forward and snatched the paper from her hands. "You can't look at those," he hissed, his first full sentence in her presence. "Nobody can look at those." "Sweetheart, Promise me," Benjamin's voice cracked with desperation. "Promise you won't tell anyone, please." Maria knelt down to his level, her heart breaking at the raw fear in his young face. This wasn't the tantrum of a spoiled rich kid. This was the terror of a child who'd learned that speaking up meant consequences he couldn't handle. "I promise," she said quietly. But Benjamin, the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway cut her off. Benjamin immediately scrambled to shove all the papers into his drawer, slamming it shut just as the bedroom door opened without a knock. Richard Hampton filled the doorway like a storm cloud, 6 feet tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Maria made in 3 months. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his face the picture of Wall Street success. But his eyes were cold, calculating, the eyes of a man who saw everything in terms of profit and loss. "What's taking so long in here?" he demanded, his gaze moving from Maria to his son. "I specifically said this room needed to be finished an hour ago." "I'm sorry, Mr. Hampton," Maria said, standing quickly. "I was just finishing up." "And you?" Richard's attention turned to Benjamin, who had shrunk back into his chair. "I trust you'll be on your best behavior tonight. Our guests are very important, and I won't tolerate any of your episodes." Benjamin nodded mutely, his small hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. "Good." Richard's smile was all teeth, no warmth. "Maria, when you're done here, Mrs. Whitfield needs you in the kitchen. We're expecting 12 guests for dinner." As his father's footsteps receded down the hallway, Benjamin's carefully controlled facade crumbled. Silent tears began streaming down his cheeks, and Maria watched helplessly as the 7-year-old boy aged decades in a matter of seconds. Carrying burdens no child should ever have to bear, she finished her cleaning in silence, but her mind was racing. Those drawings weren't just the idle scribbles of a lonely child. They were something much darker. A cry for help written in a language only someone who'd lived through similar hell could understand. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed midnight as Maria finished cleaning the last of the crystal glasses from Richard Hampton's dinner party. The evening had been a parade of power suits and polished smiles, Wall Street titans discussing mergers over aged scotch while their wives compared vacation homes in the Hamptons. Through it all, Benjamin had made a brief, choreographed appearance, dressed in a miniature navy blazer, shaking hands with practiced politeness before being whisked away by his nanny. But Maria had seen what the others missed, the way the boy's hands trembled when Mr. Blackwood, Richard's business partner, ruffled his hair. How Benjamin's face went chalk white when the man suggested he stop by for a private chat soon. The other adults had laughed at what they perceived as childhood shyness. Maria had recognized it as something far more sinister. Over the following weeks, she began paying closer attention to Benjamin's routines, watching for patterns in his behavior. What she discovered made her stomach churn with familiar dread. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 3 o'clock, Dr. Marcus Whitmore arrived for Benjamin's advanced tutoring sessions. The man was in his 50s, distinguished-looking with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, carrying the credentials of Harvard and Yale like badges of honor. He'd been recommended by several elite families, Mrs. Whitfield had mentioned proudly, and was considered one of the finest private tutors money could buy. But Maria noticed things others didn't. How Benjamin would disappear into the bathroom before each session, sometimes emerging with red-rimmed eyes. How the boy would position himself near windows during their meetings, as if planning escape routes. Most telling of all, how Benjamin's most disturbing drawings always appeared in the days immediately following Dr. Whitmore's visits. "Is everything all right up there?" Maria asked Mrs. Whitfield one Thursday afternoon, nodding toward the second-floor study where muffled voices could be heard through the closed door. Mrs. Whitfield looked up from polishing the silver tea service, her expression sharp with disapproval. "That's not your concern, Mrs. Gonzalez. Dr. Whitmore is preparing Benjamin for admission to prestigious boarding schools. The boy needs discipline and structure. He's only 7 years old," Maria said quietly. "Exactly, which is why he needs to learn proper behavior now." Mrs. Whitfield's tone brooked no argument. "The Hampton family has standards to maintain. That boy will inherit a fortune someday. He needs to be molded into someone worthy of it." Maria bit her tongue, but the conversation gnawed at her throughout the day. That evening, as she was collecting laundry from Benjamin's room, she found him sitting on his bed, staring blankly at the wall. "How was your lesson today, mijo?" she asked gently, using the Spanish endearment that had slipped out naturally. Benjamin's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide and frightened. "I'm not supposed to talk about the lessons," he whispered. "Dr. Whitmore says it's our special secret. He says if I tell anyone, I'll get in trouble with Daddy." Maria's blood ran cold. She'd heard those same words from her own niece 2 years ago, before her sister had found the courage to press charges against their neighbor. The language of predators was universal, always cloaked in terms of special relationships and dangerous secrets. "Benjamin," she said carefully, sitting on the edge of his bed, "you know you can tell me anything, right? I would never get you in trouble." The boy studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she could be trusted. Finally, he reached under his mattress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His latest drawing was even more disturbing than the first. Stick figures in positions that made Maria's heart race with rage and recognition. "He says this is what smart boys do," Benjamin whispered, pointing to the larger figure on the paper. "He says my daddy did it too when he was my age, and that's why he's so successful now." Maria closed her eyes, fighting the urge to vomit. The grooming was textbook. Normalize the behavior, implicate the parent, make the child feel complicit and special all at once. She'd seen it before, and the damage it caused lasted lifetimes. "Benjamin, listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions raging inside her. "Nothing about this is normal or okay, and whatever Dr. Whitmore told you about your daddy, that's not true. But he knows things," Benjamin said desperately. "He knows about Mommy leaving. He says she left because I was bad, because I didn't do what I was supposed to do." The manipulation was so complete, so calculated, that Maria had to grip the bedspread to keep her hands from shaking. "Your mama didn't leave because of anything you did, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have problems that have nothing to do with their children." Benjamin's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand. "I'm not supposed to cry. Dr. Whitmore says crying is for weak people, and weak people don't deserve nice things." Maria wanted to pull the child into her arms and promise him that everything would be okay, but she knew that false hope could be just as damaging as the truth. Instead, she chose her words carefully. "Some of the strongest people I know cry when they need to," she said softly. "Your feelings matter, Benjamin. They're not wrong or weak. They're yours, and they're important." Over the next few days, Maria found herself studying the house's layout with new eyes. The second-floor study, where the tutoring sessions took place, was isolated at the end of a long hallway, with thick walls that would muffle sound. Dr. Whitmore always insisted the door remain locked during lessons, claiming it was to minimize distractions. The rest of the staff had been trained not to interrupt, viewing his methods as eccentrically brilliant rather than suspicious. She began documenting everything she could remember: dates, at times, Benjamin's behavior patterns, specific comments he'd made. Her own experience with abuse had taught her that details mattered when adults finally decided to listen. But she also knew the delicate balance she had to maintain. One wrong move, one accusation without irrefutable proof, and she'd be dismissed as a disgruntled employee with an overactive imagination. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday in November. Dr. Whitmore had arrived for his usual session, but left abruptly after only 30 minutes, claiming he felt unwell. Maria was dusting the hallway when she heard sobbing from the study. She found Benjamin curled up in a corner behind the heavy oak desk, his small body shaking with silent tears. "What happened, Mijo?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "I couldn't do it today," Benjamin whispered through his tears. "I told him I felt sick and he got really angry," he said. "He said next time he'd have to tell Daddy that I was being difficult." Maria's heart clenched. The boy had found the courage to resist, and now he was terrified of the consequences. This was the moment she'd been dreading, when Benjamin's instinctive self-preservation would clash with his learned compliance. "You did nothing wrong," she said firmly. "Nothing at all. You were brave today. But what if he tells Daddy? What if Daddy sends me away like he did with Mommy?" The fear in Benjamin's voice was soul-crushing. At 7 years old, he was already calculating the political ramifications of his resistance, weighing his own safety against the threat of abandonment. It was a burden no child should ever have to carry. That night, Maria lay awake in her small apartment in Hempstead, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with impossible choices. She'd taken this job to escape her own nightmare, to build a new life where she could finally feel safe. But how could she stay silent when another vulnerable person was trapped in a web of manipulation and fear? She thought about her own childhood in El Salvador, about the uncle whose games had stolen her innocence and taught her that speaking up only made things worse. She remembered the years of therapy, the broken relationships, the way trauma had shaped every decision she'd ever made. Benjamin was living the beginning of that same story, and she was possibly the only person in his orbit who could recognize it. By morning, Maria had made her decision. She would gather evidence methodically, build an irrefutable case, and find a way to protect Benjamin without destroying her own fragile stability. She didn't know how yet, but she knew she couldn't look away. Some battles chose you, and this one had her name written on it in a 7-year-old's desperate drawings. The war for Benjamin Hampton's childhood had begun, fought in whispered conversations and hidden artwork, where the enemy wore expensive suits and held impeccable references, and the battlefield was a mansion that looked like paradise from the outside. The December snow fell silently outside the mansion's tall windows, blanketing the perfectly manicured grounds in pristine white that would be cleared away by dawn. Maria stood in the kitchen at 5:30 a.m., preparing her morning coffee before the household stirred to life. The early hours had become her sanctuary, the only time when the oppressive atmosphere of secrets and silence lifted enough for her to breathe freely. She'd been documenting Benjamin's situation for 3 weeks now, keeping a careful journal hidden in her apartment. Every interaction with Dr. Whitmore, every change in Benjamin's behavior, every overheard conversation was meticulously recorded. But the weight of what she knew was crushing her, manifesting in sleepless nights and a constant knot of anxiety in her stomach. The sound of bare feet on marble made her turn. Benjamin appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing Spider-Man pajamas that seemed too large for his thin frame. His blonde hair was disheveled from sleep, but his eyes held that haunting alertness she'd grown to recognize, the hypervigilance of a child who'd learned to monitor every shadow for potential threats. "Couldn't sleep again, mijo?" Maria asked softly, pouring him a glass of warm milk without being asked. It had become their morning ritual, these stolen moments before the performance of normal family life began. Benjamin nodded, climbing onto one of the high stools at the kitchen island. "I had the dream again," he whispered, accepting the milk with hands that trembled slightly. "The one where I'm running, but my legs won't work right." Maria's heart ached. She'd had similar dreams herself, anxiety manifesting in scenarios of paralysis and helplessness. "Dreams can feel very real sometimes," she said carefully, "but they can't hurt you." "Dr. Whitmore says dreams mean things," Benjamin said, staring into his milk. "He says when children have bad dreams, it means they're fighting against what's supposed to happen, like their brains are broken." The casual cruelty of the manipulation made Maria's jaw clench. She forced her voice to remain gentle. "Dr. Whitmore isn't always right about everything, sweetheart. Dreams are just our minds processing things while we sleep. Having them doesn't mean anything is wrong with you." Benjamin looked up at her with those two old eyes. "Do you have bad dreams?" The question hung between them, loaded with more weight than a 7-year-old should be able to carry. Maria realized this was a test of sorts. Benjamin was trying to determine if she truly understood, if she was safe to confide in. "Sometimes I do," she admitted quietly. "When I was growing up, and even now sometimes. Dreams about feeling scared or trapped. Did someone hurt you too?" Benjamin's voice was barely a whisper. The directness of the question took Maria's breath away. She looked at this small boy, seeing herself at the same age, the same desperate need for validation, for someone to acknowledge that the confusing, painful experiences were real and wrong. "Yes," she said simply. "Someone did hurt me when I was about your age." Benjamin's eyes filled with tears that he quickly tried to blink away. "Did you tell anyone?" "I tried to, but the adults didn't believe me. They said I was making things up or misunderstanding." Maria's own voice caught as she remembered her mother's dismissive wave, her teacher's uncomfortable redirection of the conversation. "But that doesn't mean I was wrong to try." "What happened to the person who hurt you?" "Nothing happened to him," Maria said honestly. "He was an important person in our community, and people didn't want to believe he could do bad things. But he was wrong, Benjamin. What he did was wrong, just like what's happening to you is wrong." Benjamin's milk glass slipped from his small hands, shattering against the kitchen floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. Both of them froze, listening for signs that someone had heard. After a moment of tense silence, Maria knelt to clean up the glass while Benjamin watched with growing panic. "I'm sorry," he whispered frantically. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" Hey, Maria soothed, abandoning the cleanup to focus on him. "It's okay. Accidents happen. Nobody's going to be angry about a glass." But Benjamin was already retreating into himself, his brief moment of openness slamming shut like a steel door. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made him slide off the stool and back toward the door. "I should go back to my room," he mumbled. Not meeting her eyes, Richard Hampton appeared in the kitchen doorway moments later, immaculate even at 6 a.m. in his silk pajamas and matching robe. His presence immediately filled the space with tension, and Maria noticed how Benjamin unconsciously positioned himself near the exit. "What's all the commotion down here?" Richard asked, his voice carrying the irritation of a man unused to having his routine disrupted. "Just a small accident, Mr. Hampton," Maria said quickly. "I was cleaning up." Richard's gaze moved between Maria and his son, calculating. "Benjamin, what are you doing up so early? And why aren't you wearing your slippers?" Dr. Whitmore specifically mentioned that discipline starts with proper presentation. Benjamin's shoulders hunched forward. "I couldn't sleep, Daddy. I was just getting some milk." "Insomnia is a sign of an undisciplined mind," Richard said coldly. "We'll need to discuss this with Dr. Whitmore during your next session. Perhaps your bedtime routine needs adjustment." Maria watched Benjamin's face go pale at the mention of the tutor, and she had to bite her tongue to keep from intervening. Richard continued his lecture about proper behavior and family expectations, while his 7-year-old son stood there like a prisoner receiving sentence. "Go back to your room now," Richard finally commanded. "And Benjamin?" "No more midnight wandering. The staff has enough to do without cleaning up after your carelessness." After Benjamin disappeared upstairs, Richard turned his attention to Maria. His pale blue eyes were sharp with suspicion, and she felt like a specimen under a microscope. "Mrs. Gonzalez, I trust you understand the importance of maintaining boundaries with the household staff," he said smoothly. "Benjamin is a sensitive child, and we can't have him forming inappropriate attachments. Dr. Whitmore has advised us that too much coddling will interfere with his development." The threat was delivered with Wall Street precision, polite on the surface, but razor-sharp underneath. Maria nodded, keeping her expression neutral while her mind raced. "Of course, Mr. Hampton, I understand completely." "Good. I'd hate to have to find a replacement so close to the holidays." Richard's smile was all teeth. "The boy needs consistency, especially given his recent behavioral challenges." After Richard left for his morning workout, Maria finished cleaning up the broken glass with hands that shook with suppressed rage. The man spoke about his son like he was a problematic stock portfolio that needed rebalancing, not a traumatized child crying out for help. She thought about her own father, a hard-working construction worker who'd worked double shifts to provide for his family. He hadn't had Richard Hampton's wealth or education, but he'd never spoken to Maria with such casual cruelty. Money, she was learning, could buy a lot of things, but it couldn't purchase basic human decency. The rest of the morning passed in tense routine. Mrs. Whitfield assigned Maria to clean the second-floor study in preparation for Dr. Whitmore's afternoon session, a task that felt like a sick joke, given what she knew about what happened in that room. As she dusted the bookshelves filled with psychology texts and educational theory, Maria found herself studying the space with the eyes of someone planning a rescue mission. The study was indeed isolated, with thick walls and heavy curtains that could muffle sound. There were no security cameras. Richard Hampton valued his privacy too much to allow surveillance in his personal spaces. The door had a heavy deadbolt that could be locked from the inside, ostensibly to prevent interruptions during important lessons. As Maria worked, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On Dr. Whitmore's usual seat, a leather armchair positioned to face away from the door, there were faint stains on the fabric. Old stains, the kind that came from repeated incidents over time. Her experience cleaning had taught her to recognize the signs of bodily fluids that had been hastily wiped away but never properly treated. The discovery hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just emotional manipulation or inappropriate touching. This was systematic, ongoing abuse happening in plain sight while a household full of adults looked the other way. Benjamin's drawings hadn't been metaphorical expressions of discomfort. They'd been literal documentation of crimes being committed against him twice a week, every week, for who knew how long. Maria sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd uncovered. She thought about her own recovery, the years of therapy it had taken to rebuild herself after her uncle's abuse. Benjamin was only 7 years old, just beginning to understand that what was happening to him wasn't normal. Every day that passed would add another layer to the trauma, another year of healing he'd need if he survived this with his sanity intact. The sound of the front door opening snapped her back to the present. Dr. Whitmore's voice drifted up from the foyer, smooth and educated as he exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Whitfield. Soon, he'd be climbing those stairs with his briefcase full of educational materials and psychological manipulation, ready to continue his systematic destruction of a child's innocence. But today would be different, Maria decided. Today, she would find a way to bear witness to what happened in this room, to gather the evidence she needed to finally break through the wall of willful blindness that surrounded Benjamin Hampton. She didn't know exactly how yet, but she knew her window of opportunity was closing fast. The predator was already in the house, and time was running out. Maria's hands shook as she positioned herself in the supply closet across from the study. The door cracked just enough to provide a narrow view of the hallway. She'd spent the morning rehearsing this moment, knowing that what she witnessed today could change everything or destroy her life if she was caught. The old building's thick walls would muffle most sounds, but she'd brought a small recording device hidden in her cleaning supplies, praying it would pick up something, anything that could serve as evidence. Dr. Whitmore had arrived 20 minutes ago, his silver BMW pulling up to the circular drive with the confidence of a man who'd never questioned his right to be anywhere. From her hiding spot, Maria had watched him climb the stairs with his leather briefcase, his movements deliberate and practiced. This wasn't his first time in this house, and it certainly wouldn't be his last, unless someone finally found the courage to stop him. The study door clicked shut with the finality of a prison cell. Maria held her breath, listening to the muffled voices within. Dr. Whitmore's tone was warm and paternal, the voice of a beloved teacher discussing academic progress. But Maria had learned to distrust charm. Her ex-husband had possessed the same ability to transform from monster to saint depending on his audience. "Now then, Benjamin," she heard through the thick oak door, "I hope you've been practicing the exercises we discussed last time. Remember, these lessons are preparing you for great things. Your father was once exactly where you are now." Maria's stomach lurched. The implication that Richard Hampton had endured similar abuse as a child reframed everything she thought she knew about the family dynamic. Had the cycle of victimization been passed down through generations, normalized and justified as some twisted form of character building? A small voice responded, Benjamin's words too quiet to make out, but the tone conveyed resignation mixed with fear. Maria pressed the recording device closer to the door, knowing that audio evidence might be her only chance to convince anyone of what was happening in this room. The conversation continued for several minutes, Dr. Whitmore's voice occasionally dropping to a whisper that made Maria's skin crawl. She caught fragments, mentions of special privileges, mature responsibilities, and keeping our arrangements confidential. The language was carefully coded, designed to sound educational to any casual listener, while carrying much darker meaning to those who understood the subtext. Then came a sound that made Maria's blood freeze. Benjamin crying, the soft, muffled sobs of a child trying desperately not to make noise. Dr. Whitmore's voice turned sharper, more commanding, though still maintaining its veneer of professorial authority. "Compose yourself, Benjamin. We've discussed this before. Emotional outbursts are counterproductive to your development. Now let's continue with today's lesson." The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by an unnatural silence that was somehow more disturbing than the tears. Maria could picture Benjamin forcing himself to comply, shutting down his natural responses in order to survive the next hour. She'd done the same thing at his age, learning to disconnect from her body and emotions until the ordeal was over. A sudden noise from downstairs made Maria's heart leap. Mrs. Whitfield calling for her from the kitchen. If she was discovered hiding in the closet, her entire investigation would be exposed, and Benjamin would lose his only potential advocate. But leaving now meant abandoning the child to whatever was happening behind that locked door. "Mrs. Gonzalez." Mrs. Whitfield's voice was getting closer, her footsteps on the stairs heavy with irritation. "Where are you?" We have preparations to make for this evening's dinner party. Maria made the agonizing decision to slip out of the closet and intercept Mrs. Whitfield before she reached the second floor. She emerged into the hallway with her cleaning supplies, trying to look busy and innocent. "I'm here, Mrs. Whitfield," she called softly, moving toward the stairs. "I was just finishing the upstairs bathrooms." The older woman's suspicious gaze swept the hallway before settling on Maria. "Well, come along then. Mr. Hampton has invited several important clients for dinner, and everything must be perfect. We can't have any distractions." As they descended the stairs together, Maria caught one last sound from the study that made her stomach turn. Dr. Whitmore's voice, low and commanding, followed by what sounded like furniture being moved. She wanted to run back up those stairs, to pound on that door and demand that the session end immediately. But she knew such an action would only result in her immediate termination and Benjamin's complete isolation from any potential help. In the kitchen, Mrs. Whitfield assigned Maria to polishing silver while rattling off instructions for the evening's elaborate dinner service. But Maria's mind was elsewhere, replaying every sound she'd heard from the study, trying to decode the horror hidden behind academic language. "Pay attention when I'm speaking to you," Mrs. Whitfield snapped, her voice cutting through Maria's distraction. "This dinner is crucial for Mr. Hampton's business dealings. Senator Morrison will be attending, along with several other influential guests. There can be no mistakes." Maria nodded absently, then froze as the implication hit her. Senator Morrison. She'd seen his name in the news recently, always photographed at charity events benefiting children's organizations. The irony was so bitter it made her physically sick. Here was a man who built his political career on protecting children, dining in a house where a child was being systematically abused just one floor above. "Will Benjamin be joining the dinner?" Maria asked carefully. "Of course not," Mrs. Whitfield replied dismissively. "Children don't belong at adult dinner parties. He'll have his meal in his room after his tutoring session concludes." The casual way she discussed Benjamin's isolation told Maria everything she needed to know about how the household functioned. The boy existed in a separate sphere from his father's social and business life, invisible to the powerful people who might have intervened if they'd known what was happening under their noses. An hour later, Dr. Whitmore emerged from the study, his appearance as immaculate as when he'd arrived. Maria watched from the kitchen doorway as he descended the stairs, briefcase in hand, chatting pleasantly with Mrs. Whitfield about Benjamin's remarkable progress and natural aptitude for advanced learning. "The boy shows real promise," Dr. Whitmore was saying, his voice warm with manufactured pride. "With continued guidance, I believe he'll develop into exactly the kind of man his father wants him to become." The double meaning in his words made Maria feel sick. She waited until he'd left before slipping upstairs to check on Benjamin. She found him in his room, sitting on his bed with a fresh drawing spread across his lap. This one was different from the others, more detailed, more specific, showing things that no 7-year-old should know how to draw. "Benjamin," she said softly, sitting beside him on the bed. "How are you feeling, mijo?" He looked up at her with eyes that seemed decades older than they had that morning. "Dr. Whitmore says I'm making excellent progress," he recited mechanically. "He says I should be proud of how well I'm learning." The robotic delivery of the words chilled Maria to the bone. This was how victims learned to survive, by adopting their abuser's language, by convincing themselves that their compliance was a form of achievement rather than a desperate attempt to minimize harm. "What do you think?" Maria asked gently. "How do you feel about your lessons?" Benjamin's carefully constructed facade wavered for just a moment, and she saw the real child underneath, terrified, confused, and desperately alone. "I think," he started, then stopped, glancing toward the door as if Dr. Whitmore might still be listening. "I think I want them to stop." It was the first time he'd directly expressed his own desires, rather than parroting what he'd been told to feel. Maria felt a surge of hope mixed with renewed determination. The real Benjamin was still in there, buried under layers of manipulation and fear, but not completely destroyed. "That's an important feeling," she told him carefully. "Your feelings matter, even when other people tell you they don't." That evening, as Maria served wine to senators and business moguls in the mansion's formal dining room, she listened to their conversations about market forecasts and political strategy. These were powerful people, the kind who could move mountains with a phone call or destroy careers with a whispered word. Yet none of them had any idea that a child was suffering in the room directly above their heads. The disconnect was staggering. Richard Hampton played the perfect host, regaling his guests with stories of his son's academic achievements and promising future. He spoke about Benjamin with the pride of a man displaying a prize thoroughbred, never once mentioning the boy's obvious distress or the concerning changes in his behavior. As the evening wore on, Maria found herself studying the guests, wondering if any of them had children of their own, if any of them would recognize the signs, if their own child was being abused. The answer, she realized with growing despair, was probably not. These people lived in a world where appearances mattered more than truth, where inconvenient realities were buried beneath layers of social protocol and willful ignorance. By the time she finished cleaning up after the dinner party, it was nearly midnight. The house had settled into its familiar oppressive silence, but Maria's mind was racing with everything she'd learned. The recording device in her pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, evidence of crimes that might never see the light of day unless she found the courage to risk everything. As she prepared to leave for the night, Maria made a decision that would change the course of both her life and Benjamin's. Tomorrow, she would begin researching Dr. Marcus Whitmore, digging into his background and looking for patterns that might reveal other victims. She would also start reaching out to organizations that specialized in child abuse cases, gathering information about legal options and protection services. The war for Benjamin Hampton's childhood was escalating, and Maria was preparing to take the battle to enemy territory. She didn't know if she was strong enough to win, but she knew she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try. Maria's laptop screen glowed in the darkness of her small Hempstead apartment, casting harsh shadows across her face as she scrolled through search results at 2 a.m. She'd been researching Dr. Marcus Whitmore for 3 days now, following digital breadcrumbs that painted a disturbing picture of a predator who'd spent decades perfecting his craft. Sleep had become elusive, replaced by an obsessive need to understand exactly who they were dealing with. Dr. Whitmore's credentials were impeccable on the surface. Harvard PhD in educational psychology, former professor at Columbia, published researcher in child development. His client list read like a who's who of New York's elite families, testimonials praising his innovative methods and remarkable success in preparing children for prestigious institutions. But Maria had learned to look beneath polished surfaces, and what she found there made her blood run cold. The pattern emerged slowly, hidden in the gaps between glowing recommendations. Dr. Whitmore never stayed with any family for more than 2 years. His contracts always included strict confidentiality clauses. Most tellingly, several of the children he'd successfully tutored had later been quietly enrolled in therapeutic boarding, schools, facilities that specialized in treating traumatized adolescents. Maria's phone buzzed, with a text from her sister Carmen in Queens. "Haven't heard from you in weeks. Everything okay?" Everything was decidedly not okay, but Maria couldn't explain that she was currently conducting a one-woman investigation into a child abuse ring operating among New York's most powerful families. Instead, she typed back, "Just busy with work. We'll call soon." The lie tasted bitter, but the truth was too dangerous to share. If her investigation was discovered prematurely, Benjamin would lose his only advocate, and Dr. Whitmore would simply move on to his next victim. Maria had seen enough crime shows to know that predators like him didn't operate in isolation. They had networks, systems of protection that ensured their survival. A new search result caught her attention. A newspaper article from 3 years ago about a custody battle involving the wealthy Pemberton family. The details were sparse, sealed by court order, but one line made Maria's heart race. Dr. Marcus Whitmore, who had been providing private tutoring services to the family's youngest son, was dismissed from his position following undisclosed allegations. Maria spent the next hour trying to track down information about the Pemberton case, but every lead hit a dead end. Records sealed, participants bound by non-disclosure agreements, media coverage mysteriously sparse despite the family's high profile. It was as if the entire incident had been surgically removed from public consciousness. The next morning at the Hampton mansion, Maria found herself hyper-aware of every interaction, every casual conversation that might reveal more about how the system of silence operated. Mrs. Whitfield was in the kitchen, briefing the temporary chef about dietary restrictions for another upcoming dinner party. Mr. Hampton specifically requested that we not serve anything too exotic, Mrs. Whitfield was saying. Judge Hartwell has a sensitive stomach, and we can't afford any complications. This dinner could determine whether the judge's grandson is accepted into the same preparatory program as Benjamin. Maria's ears perked up at the mention of another child being prepared for Dr. Whitmore's program. She busied herself with organizing the pantry while listening to the conversation. "How many children are currently in Dr. Whitmore's care?" the chef asked innocently. "Oh, quite a few," Mrs. Whitfield replied with pride. "He's very selective about his students, only the most promising children from the finest families. It's considered quite an honor to be accepted." The casual way she discussed what Maria now understood to be a systematic operation made her stomach churn. How many other children were currently enduring what Benjamin faced twice a week? How many families had been convinced that abuse was actually advanced education? Later that afternoon, as Maria cleaned the first-floor library, she overheard Richard Hampton on a phone call in his study. The door was slightly ajar, and his voice carried clearly down the hallway. "I understand your concerns, Robert, but Dr. Whitmore's methods are unorthodox precisely because they're effective," Richard was saying. "My son has shown remarkable improvement in discipline and compliance since beginning the program. Sometimes children need to be pushed beyond their comfort zones to reach their full potential." There was a pause as the person on the other end responded. Then Richard continued, "The Vanderburg boy? Yes, I heard about that unfortunate situation. But you have to understand, some children simply aren't suited for advanced development. It's not Dr. Whitmore's fault if a particular student can't handle the rigor of his curriculum." Maria felt sick. They were discussing children like products being tested for market viability, casually dismissing failures as defective rather than recognizing them as victims who'd had the courage to speak up. The Vanderburg case, another lead to research, another family whose child had apparently tried to escape the system. That evening, Benjamin appeared in the kitchen while Maria was preparing his dinner tray. He moved like a ghost, his small feet making no sound on the marble floor. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he wasn't sleeping well, and his clothes hung loose on his increasingly thin frame. "Mrs. Maria," he said quietly, using the formal address Dr. Whitmore had insisted upon, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, mijo," Maria replied, her heart aching at how carefully he modulated his voice, as if afraid of being overheard even in the empty kitchen. "Do you think some secrets are okay to tell?" Benjamin asked, his blue eyes searching her face for answers she wasn't sure she could provide safely. Maria knelt down to his level, choosing her words carefully. "I think secrets that keep people safe are sometimes necessary, but secrets that protect people who are hurting others, those kinds of secrets are different." Benjamin processed this for a moment, his young mind working through concepts no child should have to consider. "Dr. Whitmore says our lessons are special secrets. He says if I tell anyone about them, it would hurt Daddy's business and make me responsible for bad things happening. The manipulation was so calculated, so perfectly designed to ensure the child's silence, that Maria had to grip the kitchen counter to steady herself. Benjamin, listen to me very carefully. You are not responsible for other people's choices or actions. If telling the truth about what happens to you would cause problems for adults, that's because those adults made bad choices, not because you're doing anything wrong. A tear slipped down Benjamin's cheek, quickly wiped away with the back of his hand. But what if nobody believes me? Dr. Whitmore says adults trust other adults more than children, especially children who might be confused about what really happened. Maria's heart shattered. The boy had been so thoroughly conditioned to doubt his own perceptions that he couldn't trust his basic instincts about right and wrong. This was the ultimate goal of sophisticated predators, to convince their victims that their reality was unreliable, that their pain was imaginary, that their abuser was actually their savior. Some adults do make that mistake, Maria admitted honestly, but not all of them. There are adults whose job it is to believe children and protect them, even when it's hard or complicated. Really? Benjamin's voice was barely a whisper, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. Really, Maria confirmed, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. Her own experience with authority figures had been disappointing at best, devastating at worst. But Benjamin needed to believe that help was possible, that his situation wasn't permanent. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Benjamin immediately step away from Maria, his body language shifting into the careful neutrality he'd learned to adopt whenever adults were present. Richard Hampton appeared in the kitchen doorway, his presence immediately filling the space with tension. "Benjamin, what are you doing down here? Mrs. Whitfield said your dinner was sent to your room an hour ago." "I was just getting some water, Daddy," Benjamin replied, his voice perfectly modulated to sound respectful but not overly emotional. "Water is available in your bathroom," Richard said coldly. "There's no need to wander the house bothering the staff. Maria has work to do without being interrupted by unnecessary requests." Maria watched Benjamin's face carefully, seeing the flash of hurt that he quickly suppressed. The boy was learning that even basic human needs like comfort or conversation were inconveniences to be managed rather than natural desires to be fulfilled. "Of course, sir," Benjamin said quietly. "I'm sorry for the interruption." As father and son left the kitchen together, Maria heard Richard's voice continuing down the hallway. "Dr. Whitmore mentioned that you seemed distracted during your last session. We'll need to discuss ways to improve your focus and attention. Perhaps earlier bedtimes and fewer privileges until your performance improves." The casual way Richard discussed restricting his son's already limited freedoms as punishment for showing signs of trauma made Maria's hands shake with suppressed rage. The system wasn't just enabling Dr. Whitmore's abuse, it was actively supporting it, creating conditions that made Benjamin even more vulnerable and isolated. That night, Maria added new entries to her hidden journal, documenting the conversation about Judge Hartwell's grandson and the mysterious Vanderberg case. Her research was revealing the outline of something much larger than one predator targeting one child. This was an organized network that had been operating for years, protected by wealth, influence, and the willful blindness of people who prioritized reputation over children's safety. But Maria was also discovering something else. She wasn't as powerless as she'd believed. Knowledge was a form of power, and she was accumulating more of it every day. The question was whether she'd gather enough evidence to break through the wall of protection surrounding Dr. Whitmore before it was too late for Benjamin and for all the other children trapped in the same nightmare. The battle lines were becoming clearer, and Maria was beginning to understand that this war would require more than just courage. It would require strategy, allies, and a willingness to risk everything for the chance to save a child who'd been abandoned by everyone else who should have protected him. The black Lincoln town car pulled through the Hampton estate gates on a crisp February morning, its arrival causing a ripple of nervous energy throughout the household staff. Maria watched from the second-floor window as the driver opened the rear door, revealing a woman who commanded attention without saying a word. Eleanor Hampton Blackwood stepped onto the circular drive with the bearing of someone accustomed to deference. Her silver hair immaculately styled beneath a black wide-brimmed hat, her Chanel coat speaking of old money and older power. Mrs. Whitfield had been in a state of barely controlled panic for 3 days, ever since Richard had announced his mother's unexpected visit. The woman was a legend in New York society circles, the widow of a Supreme Court justice, philanthropist, and guardian of the Hampton family reputation for over 40 years. She visited the estate perhaps twice a year, and never without advance notice measured in weeks, not days. "Mrs. Gonzalez," Mrs. Whitfield hissed, appearing beside Maria at the window. "Stop gawking and get to work. Mrs. Hampton Blackwood expects perfection, and I won't have any staff member embarrassing this household." Maria nodded, but her attention remained fixed on the scene below. Benjamin had appeared at the front door, dressed in his formal navy blazer and pressed khakis, his small hand held firmly by his father. Even from this distance, Maria could see the tension in the boy's posture, the careful way he positioned himself slightly behind Richard's leg. Eleanor Hampton Blackwood approached her grandson with measured steps, her keen grey eyes studying him with an intensity that made Maria's skin prickle. The woman was 78 years old, but age had sharpened rather than dulled her presence. She bent slightly to accept Benjamin's dutiful kiss on her cheek, her gloved hand resting on his shoulder for a moment longer than mere formality required. "She sees something," Maria murmured to herself, recognizing the look of someone whose trained eye had caught details others missed. Over the next few hours, Maria observed the family dynamics with new interest as she went about her duties. Eleanor had been installed in the mansion's most luxurious guest suite, but she spent little time there, instead moving through the house with the purpose of a general inspecting troops. She questioned Mrs. Whitfield about household routines, examined Benjamin's schoolwork, and made pointed inquiries about his tutoring schedule. "Dr. Whitmore comes twice a week?" Eleanor asked during lunch, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to straight answers. She sat at the head of the dining table like a queen holding court, her posture perfect despite her age. "Tuesday and Thursday afternoons," Richard confirmed, cutting his salmon with surgical precision. "Benjamin has shown remarkable progress under his guidance. The boy's discipline and focus have improved dramatically." Maria, serving wine from a crystal decanter, noticed how Benjamin's fork trembled slightly at the mention of Dr. Whitmore. Eleanor noticed too, her sharp gaze shifting to her grandson's downcast face. "And what subjects does Dr. Whitmore teach?" Eleanor inquired, her tone deceptively casual. "Advanced preparatory work," Richard replied smoothly. "Mathematics, literature, character development. The foundation work necessary for admission to proper institutions." "Character development," Eleanor repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "How exactly does one develop character in a 7-year-old, Richard?" There was something in her voice, a subtle challenge, that made Richard shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Through discipline, Mother. Through teaching him that life requires sacrifice and dedication. Surely you understand the importance of preparing him for leadership." Eleanor's laugh was sharp as winter air. "I understand many things, darling, including the difference between preparing a child for leadership and breaking his spirit entirely." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Benjamin hadn't touched his food, his eyes fixed on his plate as if trying to make himself invisible. Maria found herself holding her breath, sensing that something significant was happening beneath the surface of this seemingly polite conversation. Benjamin, Eleanor said suddenly, her voice gentling as she addressed the boy directly. Would you like to show me your room after lunch? I'd love to see how you've arranged your things. Benjamin's head snapped up, surprise and something that might have been hope flickering in his eyes. Yes, grandmother, I would like that. Richard started to object. Mother, I'm sure you're tired from your journey. Perhaps. I'm perfectly fine, Richard. Eleanor's tone brooked no argument. A grandmother should know her grandson's private spaces, don't you think? An hour later, Maria was dusting the hallway outside Benjamin's room when she heard voices through the partially open door. Eleanor had been in there for 20 minutes, and the conversation had grown increasingly quiet and serious. These are interesting drawings. Benjamin, Eleanor was saying, her voice carefully neutral, you're quite artistic. Dr. Whitmore says art is for people who can't excel at important things, Benjamin replied mechanically. There was a long pause before Eleanor spoke again. Dr. Whitmore is entitled to his opinion, but I happen to disagree. Art often tells us truths that words cannot express. May I ask you about this one? Maria risked a glance through the crack in the door. Eleanor was holding one of Benjamin's drawings, not one of the disturbing ones, but a simpler sketch of stick figures that still carried undertones of distress. I don't remember drawing that one, Benjamin said quickly, the rehearsed response of a child who'd learned to deny his own memories. Eleanor set the drawing aside and picked up another. And this one? The figures seemed to be in some sort of educational setting? Benjamin's breathing became shallow. Those are just practice drawings. Dr. Whitmore says I need to practice drawing authority figures to understand proper respect. Eleanor's silence stretched so long that Maria wondered if she'd left the room. When the older woman finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to come from decades of accumulated knowledge. Benjamin, I want to tell you something about your grandmother. When I was about your age, there was a man who visited our house regularly. He was very important, very respected, and everyone spoke about how fortunate I was to receive his special attention. Maria's heart stopped. Eleanor was treading into dangerous territory, but her voice remained steady and sure. This man taught me things he said were necessary for my development as a proper young lady. He told me these lessons were our secret, that speaking about them would cause great trouble for my family. Benjamin's breathing had become audible now, quick and shallow. But you know what I learned as I grew older, Benjamin? I learned that adults who require children to keep secrets about their interactions are usually hiding things they know are wrong. Important, respected adults don't need to conduct their business in darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. Maria pressed herself against the hallway wall, hardly daring to breathe. Grandmother, Benjamin whispered finally, his voice so small it was barely audible. What happened to that man? Nothing, darling. Nothing happened to him at all. And that's something I've regretted every day for 70 years. The weight of that admission hung in the air like a thundercloud. Eleanor was revealing her own victimization, her own failure to find justice, in order to reach a frightened child who desperately needed to know he wasn't alone. But Benjamin, Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger, we live in different times now. There are people whose job it is to listen to children, to believe them, to protect them. Things don't have to remain secret forever. Dr. Whitmore says, Benjamin began. I don't care what Dr. Whitmore says, Eleanor interrupted firmly. I care what you say. I care what you feel. I care about the truth, even when it's difficult or inconvenient. There was movement in the room, the sound of someone sitting down heavily, then the soft rustle of fabric as Eleanor moved closer to her grandson. I'm going to tell you something, Benjamin, and I want you to listen carefully. You are not responsible for protecting the adults in your life. That's not your job. Your job is to be a child, to learn and grow and make mistakes and ask questions. Adults who tell you otherwise are asking you to carry burdens that don't belong to you. Maria heard the unmistakable sound of crying, not Benjamin's usual silent tears. but real, raw sobbing that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. For the first time since Maria had known him, the boy was allowing himself to feel and express his pain without trying to contain it. "That's right, darling." Eleanor's voice was infinitely gentle now. "Let it out. You've been so brave for so long, carrying all of this by yourself. But you don't have to be brave anymore. Grandmother is here now." The crying continued for several minutes, punctuated by Eleanor's soft murmurs of comfort. When it finally subsided, Benjamin's voice came through the door, small but clearer than Maria had ever heard it. "Grandmother, I think Dr. Whitmore has been doing bad things to me. Things that hurt and feel wrong. But I don't know how to make it stop." "Oh, my darling boy," Eleanor's voice cracked with emotion. "We're going to make it stop. I promise you, we're going to make it stop." Maria wiped tears from her own cheeks, overwhelmed by the breakthrough she'd just witnessed. Eleanor Hampton Blackwood had accomplished in one afternoon what months of gentle encouragement hadn't achieved. She'd given Benjamin permission to acknowledge his own truth, to trust his instincts, to believe that his pain mattered. But as Maria slipped away from the door, she knew that this conversation was only the beginning. Eleanor might have the social standing to be believed, where others would be dismissed, but she was also challenging a system that had protected predators for generations. The real battle was just beginning, and the forces arrayed against them were more powerful than one determined grandmother and a traumatized child. The war for Benjamin's freedom had gained a crucial ally, but the enemy was about to discover that their carefully constructed world of silence and complicity was under attack. The tension in the Hampton mansion was suffocating. For 3 days since Eleanor's arrival, the house had felt like a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Maria watched the family dynamics shift with the keen awareness of someone who'd learned to read danger in the smallest changes of atmosphere. Richard moved through his own home like a man walking on thin ice, his usual commanding presence diminished by his mother's penetrating stare. Benjamin had grown quieter, if that was even possible, but there was something different in his silence now, a watchful quality that suggested he was waiting for something to happen. Eleanor had requested that Dr. Whitmore's next session be postponed, claiming she wanted to spend uninterrupted time with her grandson. Richard had reluctantly agreed, but the phone conversations Maria overheard between him and the tutor grew increasingly heated as the delay stretched on. "I don't care what my mother wants," Richard's voice carried down the hallway from his study that Thursday morning. "Benjamin's education cannot be disrupted by sentimental visiting. Dr. Whitmore has a waiting list of families who would gladly take our spot." Maria was dusting the adjacent library when Eleanor's voice cut through, Richard's protests like a blade. "Richard Hampton, you will lower your voice when discussing my grandson in my presence." The sudden silence was deafening. Maria had never heard anyone speak to Richard with such authority, and the shock of it seemed to reverberate through the entire house. "Mother, I understand you have concerns, but—" "Do you?" Eleanor's voice was dangerously quiet. "Do you really understand my concerns, Richard? Because I'm beginning to wonder if you understand anything at all about what's happening in this house." Maria edged closer to the doorway, her heart pounding. This was it, the confrontation she'd sensed building since Eleanor's arrival. "I understand that you're allowing nostalgia to cloud your judgment," Richard replied, his tone growing defensive. "Benjamin needs structure and discipline, not coddling. Dr. Whitmore has achieved remarkable results." "Results?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "Is that what you call a 7-year-old child who flinches when adults speak to him, who draws pictures that would make a forensic psychologist weep, who has nightmares so severe he can barely sleep?" There was a sharp intake of breath, Richard's surprise at how much his mother had observed in just a few days. "Those are temporary adjustments," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. All children go through difficult phases during educational transitions. Educational transitions. Eleanor repeated the phrase with withering contempt. Is that what we're calling it now? Tell me, Richard, what exactly did Dr. Whitmore teach you during your own educational transitions? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Maria pressed herself against the library wall, hardly daring to breathe. I don't know what you're implying, Richard said finally, but his voice was strained. Don't you? I remember those sessions in your grandfather's study, Richard. I remember how you changed afterward, how you stopped looking at me directly, how you started having those same nightmares Benjamin has now. I remember asking your father about it and being told that boys needed to learn certain lessons to become men. The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Eleanor was revealing not just Richard's victimization, but her own complicity in allowing it to continue. I was weak then, Eleanor continued, her voice thick with decades of regret. I was a different woman, raised to believe that men knew best about such things, that questioning their methods was inappropriate. I failed you, Richard, and I've lived with that failure every day for 40 years. Mother, please! Richard's voice cracked. No, let me finish. I failed you, and now you're failing Benjamin in exactly the same way. You're perpetuating a cycle of abuse because it's easier than admitting that what happened to you was wrong. Maria heard the sound of footsteps pacing. Then Richard's voice, hollow and broken in a way she'd never heard before. Dr. Whitmore said it was necessary. He said it would make me strong, prepare me for leadership. He said all successful men had to endure certain preparations. And did it make you strong, Richard? Eleanor's voice was infinitely gentle now. Or did it teach you to disconnect from your own pain, to view children as objects to be molded, rather than human beings to be protected? The silence stretched so long that Maria wondered if they'd left the room. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I don't know how to be different. I don't know how to be the kind of father Benjamin needs. You start by protecting him, Eleanor said firmly. You start by admitting that what Dr. Whitmore is doing is wrong, and you stop it today. But the consequences, my reputation, my business relationships, will matter nothing if your son doesn't survive his childhood with his soul intact. Eleanor's words were sharp as broken glass. Do you want Benjamin to be sitting in this same room 40 years from now, having this same conversation about his own son? Maria heard movement in the room, someone standing, walking to the window. I built everything on those connections, Richard said quietly. The business, the social standing, the respect. Dr. Whitmore introduced me to half my current clients. If I accuse him, you'll lose some money and some friends who were never really friends at all, Eleanor finished. But you'll keep your son, and more importantly, you'll keep your soul. There was another long pause before Richard spoke again, his voice stronger but still uncertain. Even if I wanted to stop it, Mother, who would believe us? Dr. Whitmore is respected by everyone who matters. He has connections throughout the judicial system, the educational establishment, social services. The man is virtually untouchable. No one is untouchable when the truth comes to light, Eleanor replied. And we're not alone in this fight. Maria's heart leaped. Did Eleanor somehow know about her investigation? About the evidence she'd been gathering? What do you mean? Richard asked. I mean that predators like Dr. Whitmore always leave trails. There are always other victims, other families who've had doubts but were too afraid to speak up. And there are always witnesses, people who work in the shadows, who see things that the powerful prefer to ignore. Maria realized she was being summoned into this conversation, that Eleanor somehow knew she was listening. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the doorway of Richard's study. Both Hampton family members turned toward her, Richard's face a mask of shock and suspicion, Eleanor's showing calm determination. Mrs. Gonzalez, Eleanor said formally, I believe you have something important to share with us. Maria's mouth went dry. This was the moment she'd been preparing for. But standing in this opulent study, facing two of the most powerful people she'd ever encountered, she felt like David facing not just Goliath, but his entire army. She began, then stopped, looking at Richard's pale face. His whole world was about to come crashing down, and she was the one holding the demolition charges. "It's all right, dear," Eleanor said gently. "We're listening." Maria reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the journal where she'd been documenting Benjamin's abuse for months. Her hands shook as she opened it to the first page. "Mr. Hampton," she said quietly, "I've been watching your son for a long time. I've been writing down what I see, what I hear, what Benjamin tells me when he thinks no one else will listen." Richard's face went from pale to grey. "You've been spying on my family?" "I've been trying to protect your child," Maria replied, her voice growing stronger, "because no one else was doing it." She began reading from her journal. Dates, times, specific behaviors, direct quotes from Benjamin about his sessions with Dr. Whitmore. With each entry, Richard seemed to shrink further into his chair, the weight of his son's suffering finally penetrating the wall of denial he'd built. When Maria finished, the room was silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Richard sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "Dear God," he whispered, "what have I done? What have I allowed to happen to my own son?" Eleanor moved to stand beside her son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've made the same mistake your father made, and his father before him. But Richard, listen to me. It ends now, today, with us." Richard looked up at his mother, then at Maria, his eyes red with tears and shame. "Tell me what to do. Please just tell me what to do to fix this." Maria felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. This was what she'd been working toward for months. But she knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Dr. Whitmore wouldn't go quietly, and his network of protection ran deep through New York's elite society. "First," Eleanor said firmly, "we cancel today's session, permanently. Then we call the police, and we prepare for war." The battle for Benjamin's freedom was about to begin in earnest, and Maria knew that before it was over, all of their lives would be forever changed. The war room had been hastily assembled in Eleanor's guest suite, away from the prying eyes and ears of the household staff. Maps of Dr. Whitmore's professional network covered the antique writing desk, while Maria's journal lay open beside a digital recorder and Richard's laptop. The transformation in the mansion's atmosphere was palpable. Where once there had been suffocating silence, now there was the electric tension of people preparing for battle. Detective Sarah Chen, of the Nassau County Special Victims Unit, sat across from them, her dark eyes moving between the evidence spread before her and the three unlikely allies who had summoned her. At 38, Chen had seen enough child abuse cases to recognize the signs of a sophisticated operation. But even she seemed taken aback by the scope of what they were describing. "Mrs. Hampton Blackwood," Detective Chen said carefully, "I want to make sure I understand what you're alleging. You're claiming that Dr. Marcus Whitmore, one of the most respected private tutors in New York, has been systematically abusing children from wealthy families for decades." "That's exactly what I'm claiming," Eleanor replied crisply, "and we have evidence to support it." Richard sat hunched in his chair, looking like he'd aged a decade in the past week. The man who had commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions without hesitation now seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of what he'd allowed to happen under his own roof. "The problem," Detective Chen continued, "is that cases involving prominent individuals require extraordinary levels of proof. Dr. Whitmore has connections throughout the legal system, political establishment and social services. Any investigation would need to be airtight to survive the scrutiny it would receive." Maria felt her heart sink. She'd known this would be difficult, but hearing a law enforcement professional essentially warn them off was devastating. "So you're saying he's untouchable?" Eleanor's voice was sharp with indignation. "I'm saying we need more than testimonies and behavioral observations. We need corroborating evidence, preferably from multiple sources. One family's allegations, no matter how compelling, won't be enough to bring down someone with Dr. Whitmore's resources and connections. As if summoned by their conversation, Maria's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and felt her blood freeze. It was Mrs. Whitfield. "Mrs. Gonzalez," came the head housekeeper's sharp voice when Maria answered. "You need to return to the house immediately. Dr. Whitmore is here for his session with Benjamin, and he's quite upset about the delay. Mr. Hampton apparently forgot to inform him of the cancellation." Maria's eyes met Eleanor's across the room. They had underestimated their opponent. Dr. Whitmore was making a power play, forcing a confrontation while the family was off balance. "I'll be right there," Maria said, ending the call. "He's here?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper. "But I called his office. I left messages. He's testing us," Eleanor said grimly. "He wants to see if we'll fold under pressure." Detective Chen stood gathering her papers. "I can't be involved in any direct confrontation without proper authorization. But I strongly advise you not to allow any unsupervised contact between Dr. Whitmore and the child." The drive back to the Hampton estate felt like riding toward a battlefield. Richard sat silent in the passenger seat, while Eleanor commanded the wheel with military precision, her aged hands steady despite the circumstances. Maria clutched her journal in the back seat, knowing that the next hour would determine whether Benjamin's nightmare would finally end or continue for years to come. They arrived to find Dr. Whitmore's silver BMW parked in its usual spot near the front entrance. Through the mansion's tall windows, Maria could see figures moving in the foyer, Mrs. Whitfield gesticulating frantically while Dr. Whitmore stood with his briefcase, every inch the picture of professional concern. "Remember," Eleanor said as they approached the front door, "we control this house. He's a guest here, and an unwelcome one." But as they entered the foyer, it became clear that Dr. Whitmore had no intention of leaving quietly. He turned toward them with the practiced smile that had fooled so many families, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expensive suit immaculate. "Richard, there you are," he said warmly, as if nothing had changed. "I was concerned when Benjamin failed to appear for our session. I hope the boy isn't feeling unwell." Maria watched Richard struggle to find his voice, decades of conditioning warring with his newfound determination to protect his son. "Dr. Whitmore," Richard began hesitantly, "I think we need to discuss—" "Marcus." Eleanor's voice cut through her son's, stammering like a blade. "How lovely to see you again after all these years." Dr. Whitmore's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Eleanor, I didn't realize you were visiting. You look unchanged." The undercurrent between them was electric with decades of buried history. Maria realized that Eleanor and Dr. Whitmore knew each other far better than anyone had revealed. "Oh, I've changed quite a bit," Eleanor replied coolly. "I've learned to see things I was blind to before. Patterns that repeat themselves across generations." Dr. Whitmore's eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. "How fascinating. I find that age sometimes brings clarity, but it can also bring imagination, particularly in areas where we feel guilty about past decisions." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. He was reminding Eleanor of her own complicity in Richard's abuse, warning her that any accusations would implicate her as well. "Where is Benjamin?" Dr. Whitmore continued, his voice taking on an edge of authority. "I have a very busy schedule, and the boy's education cannot be disrupted by family drama. Benjamin will not be attending any more sessions," Richard said suddenly, his voice stronger than Maria had heard it in days. "We're terminating your services, effective immediately." Dr. Whitmore's mask of professional concern finally slipped completely. "I see. And may I ask what prompted this sudden decision? I hope you haven't been influenced by unreliable sources." His gaze shifted deliberately to Maria, and she felt the full weight of his malevolence focused on her. This was a man accustomed to getting his way, to manipulating situations to his advantage. Being challenged by a housekeeper was clearly outside his experience. "My sources are perfectly reliable," Richard replied, though his voice shook with the effort. "I've seen Benjamin's drawings. I know what you've been doing to my son." Dr. Whitmore's laugh was soft and condescending. "Children's drawings? Really, Richard? I thought you were more sophisticated than that. Children have vivid imaginations, especially troubled children from broken homes. Benjamin has been struggling with his mother's abandonment. Surely you understand that his artistic expressions reflect his emotional confusion, not any actual events." The ease with which he twisted Benjamin's trauma into a weapon against the boy was breathtaking in its cruelty. Maria watched Richard's resolve waver under the assault of Dr. Whitmore's manipulation, but Eleanor stepped forward, her voice cutting through the psychological warfare with surgical precision. "Enough, Marcus. We both know what you are. We both know what you've done. The only question now is whether you'll leave quietly or whether this becomes a very public conversation involving law enforcement." Dr. Whitmore's composure cracked visibly. "You have no idea what you're playing with, Eleanor. I have connections you can't imagine. Files on families that would destroy reputations, end careers, ruin lives. You really want to open that door? You mean the files you've been using to blackmail families into silence for decades?" Eleanor's smile was sharp as winter. "Yes, Marcus, let's absolutely open that door. Let's have a very public conversation about how you've operated your little network. I'm quite sure other families would love to finally speak freely about their experiences." The standoff stretched between them, two elderly titans of New York society locked in a battle that had been decades in the making. Maria realized that Eleanor had been preparing for this confrontation since the day she'd arrived, that her investigation into Benjamin's situation was part of a larger reckoning with her own past failures. Dr. Whitmore's eyes darted between Eleanor and Richard, calculating his options. Finally, he straightened his shoulders and picked up his briefcase. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You have no idea of the forces you're challenging, but you'll learn." He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at Richard with something that might have been pity. "You're making a terrible mistake, Richard. That boy needs discipline, structure, guidance. Without proper intervention, he'll never amount to anything. Just like his mother, the casual cruelty of the parting shot was designed to inflict maximum damage. But Richard surprised everyone, including himself, by standing straighter instead of collapsing. "Get out of my house," he said firmly, "and if you ever come near my son again, I'll kill you myself." Dr. Whitmore left without another word, but Maria knew this victory was temporary. Men like him didn't simply disappear. They regrouped, found new angles of attack, used their networks to destroy anyone who threatened their operations. As the sound of his BMW faded down the driveway, Eleanor turned to her son with something approaching pride in her eyes. "Well done, Richard. But now the real work begins. He'll try to destroy us before we can expose him. We need to be ready." Maria nodded, knowing that the war for Benjamin's freedom had just escalated to a level none of them were fully prepared for. But for the first time since she'd discovered that first crumpled drawing, she felt hope. They had faced the monster and survived the first encounter. Now they had to make sure there wouldn't be a second one. The media firestorm began exactly 72 hours after Dr. Whitmore's expulsion from the Hampton mansion. Maria first learned about it when her phone started buzzing incessantly at 6 a.m. with calls from unknown numbers, reporters who had somehow obtained her personal information and were demanding statements about allegations of misconduct involving prominent families. By the time she arrived at the estate that morning, news vans were already positioning themselves outside the gates, like vultures circling carrion. The story had broken simultaneously across multiple platforms. Prestigious tutor accused of abuse, elite Manhattan families in scandal, decades-long cover-up alleged in Upper East Side Circle. Inside the mansion, chaos reigned. Richard sat in his study, surrounded by lawyers, who spoke in urgent whispers about damage control and liability exposure. Eleanor commanded the library like a general directing troops, fielding calls from reporters, investigators, and what seemed like half of New York's power structure. Benjamin had been sequestered in his room with a child psychologist Dr. Chen had recommended, a woman who specialized in helping young victims navigate the legal system. 12 families, Eleanor announced to the assembled group as Maria entered the library. 12 families have come forward in the past 48 hours, all with similar stories about Dr. Whitmore's specialized educational methods. Maria felt a mix of vindication and horror. Vindication that Benjamin's suffering wasn't isolated, that her instincts about a larger network had been correct. Horror at the scope of the damage. Dozens of children traumatized over decades, while New York's elite looked the other way. Detective Chen, who had barely left the mansion since Dr. Whitmore's confrontation, looked up from a stack of witness statements. The Vanderberg family you mentioned, Mrs. Gonzalez, they were the first to call after the story broke. Their son is 15 now, been in therapy for 3 years. He's ready to testify. And the Pemberton case? Maria asked. Sealed records are being reopened as we speak. Turns out the family never wanted to settle. They were pressured by their own lawyers, who had connections to Dr. Whitmore's network. The mother kept detailed documentation despite the non-disclosure agreement. Eleanor set down her phone with the satisfied expression of someone who just delivered a decisive blow. That was Senator Morrison. Apparently, his chief of staff received an interesting package this morning, photographs and documents that suggest the good. Senator's charitable foundation has been receiving substantial donations from Dr. Whitmore's clients for years. He's calling for a full congressional investigation. The irony wasn't lost on Maria. Senator Morrison, who had dined in this very house while Benjamin suffered upstairs, was now positioning himself as a champion of child protection. Politics, she was learning, made strange bedfellows of former enablers and current reformers. What about Dr. Whitmore himself? Richard asked, his voice hoarse from stress and sleepless nights. Where is he now? Detective Chen's expression darkened. That's complicated. He left the country 2 days ago on a private jet bound for Switzerland. Apparently, he had contingency plans in place for exactly this scenario. Maria felt her heart sink. The predator had escaped, free to potentially harm other children in some new location where his reputation hadn't yet caught up with him. However, Chen continued, extradition proceedings are already underway, and more importantly, we've seized his files from the Manhattan office. The contents are extensive. Eleanor's eyes lit up with grim satisfaction. How extensive? Detailed records on over 40 families spanning 3 decades. Financial transactions, personal information, photographs, and what appear to be insurance policies, compromising. Material on parents who might have otherwise spoken out. The scope of the blackmail operation was staggering. Dr. Whitmore hadn't just been abusing children. He'd been documenting everything, creating leverage to ensure silence and compliance from families who might otherwise have exposed him. There's more, Chen said grimly. We found evidence of a network. Other tutors, coaches, music instructors, all operating with similar methods, all connected through a referral system that targeted specific types of families. Maria thought about all the household staff she'd encountered over the years, the careful way they'd been trained not to ask questions, not to get involved. How many other housekeepers, nannies, and chauffeurs had witnessed signs of abuse, but remained silent out of fear or ignorance? The sound of running footsteps in the hallway interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Whitfield burst into the library, her usual composure completely shattered. "They're here," she gasped. FBI agents. They have warrants to search the house, to interview staff members. They want to speak with everyone who had contact with Dr. Whitmore. Maria felt a chill of fear, despite knowing she'd done nothing wrong. Federal involvement meant this case had grown far beyond a single predator targeting wealthy families. It had become an investigation into systemic corruption that reached into the highest levels of society. The next several hours passed in a blur of interviews, searches, and revelations. Maria found herself sitting across from FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres, a woman whose steady gaze and patient demeanor suggested extensive experience with traumatized witnesses. "Mrs. Gonzalez," Agent Torres began, "your documentation has been invaluable to this investigation. The detailed records you kept, the specific observations about Benjamin's behavior, they've helped us establish patterns that corroborate what other witnesses have reported." Maria nodded, still struggling to believe that her desperate attempt to protect one child had helped expose something so much larger. "What I need to understand," Agent Torres continued, "is why you didn't report your suspicions earlier. You clearly recognized signs of abuse. What prevented you from contacting authorities?" The question struck at the heart of Maria's guilt and fear. "I was afraid no one would believe me," she said quietly. "I'm a housekeeper, an immigrant, someone with no power or influence. Dr. Whitmore was respected, connected, protected. I thought if I spoke up too soon, without enough evidence, I'd just be dismissed and Benjamin would lose his only advocate." Agent Torres leaned forward, her expression sympathetic. "But you kept gathering evidence. You documented everything. That takes courage, Mrs. Gonzalez. That takes someone who refuses to give up on a child in need." Later that evening, as the FBI teams finished their work and the lawyers departed with briefcases full of new concerns, Maria found herself alone with Benjamin in the mansion's kitchen. The boy looked older than his 7 years, the weight of the day's revelations having stripped away what remained of his childhood innocence. "Mrs. Maria," he said quietly, using the formal address that Dr. Whitmore had insisted upon, but somehow making it sound affectionate. "Are the bad things really over?" Maria knelt down to his level, looking into those blue eyes that had seen far too much. "The bad things that Dr. Whitmore was doing are over, yes. He can't hurt you anymore. But what about the other children? The ones the FBI lady talked about?" Maria's heart clenched at his concern for other victims, even while processing his own trauma. "The adults are working very hard to help them too, and because you were brave enough to tell the truth, because your grandmother and daddy finally listened, lots of children are going to be safer now." Benjamin nodded solemnly, processing this information with the gravity of someone much older. "Will I have to talk to more people? Tell the story again?" "Probably, mijo. But remember, telling the truth isn't something you should be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. You helped stop something terrible from happening to other kids." That night, as Maria prepared to leave the mansion that had become the center of a national scandal, Eleanor approached her in the foyer. The older woman looked exhausted but somehow lighter, as if a burden she'd carried for decades had finally been lifted. "Mrs. Gonzalez, Maria, I owe you an apology," Eleanor said formally. "When you first came to work here, I saw you as simply another member of the staff. I failed to recognize that you might see things the rest of us had chosen to ignore. You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Hampton Blackwood. We all did what we thought was right." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "You did what was right. The rest of us did what was convenient, what was comfortable, what allowed us to maintain our illusions. There's a difference." She paused, studying Maria's face with those sharp grey eyes that missed nothing. "I want you to know that whatever happens next, with the trials, the media attention, the inevitable attempts at retaliation, you have my full support. Financial, legal, whatever you need. You saved my grandson's life, and probably his soul. That's a debt I can never fully repay." As Maria drove home through the February night, past the news vans and photographers, still camped outside the estate gates, she reflected on how much had changed since that October morning when she'd first found Benjamin's crumpled drawing. She'd entered this house as a woman fleeing her own trauma, seeking nothing more than a safe job and a fresh start. Now she was at the center of a case that would reshape how America's elite thought about child protection, accountability, and the price of silence. The scared, powerless woman who had taken this job 6 months ago no longer existed. In her place was someone who had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act in spite of fear when innocent lives hung in the balance. The battle for Benjamin Hampton's childhood was nearly over, but the war against the systems that had enabled his abuse was just beginning. 6 months after Dr. Whitmore's network collapsed under the weight of federal investigation, the Hampton mansion felt like a different world. Sunlight streamed through windows that had once seemed perpetually shrouded in shadows, and the oppressive silence that had characterized the house had been replaced by something Maria had never expected to hear within these walls. The sound of a child laughing. Benjamin sat at the kitchen island, his small hands covered in flour as he attempted to roll out cookie dough under Maria's patient guidance. At 8 years old now, he had gained weight, his cheeks had color, and most importantly, his eyes held the spark of curiosity that should have been there all along. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. Months of therapy, careful rebuilding of trust, and patient work to help him reconnect with his own emotions. But the boy who had once flinched at unexpected sounds now chatted freely about his day at the new school Eleanor had helped select. "Mrs. Maria, I think I'm making the cookies too thick," Benjamin said, holding up a lumpy circle of dough with the critical eye of a perfectionist. "Cookies don't have to be perfect to taste good." "Me, Joe?" Maria replied, using the endearment that had become natural between them. "Sometimes the imperfect ones are the most delicious." The kitchen door swung open, and Richard entered, looking more relaxed than Maria had seen him since she'd started working for the family. The Wall Street titan, who had once measured his worth in quarterly profits and social connections, had undergone his own transformation. Therapy, both individual and family-based, had helped him confront not only his failure to protect Benjamin, but his own buried trauma from childhood. "How are the master bakers doing?" Richard asked, genuinely smiling as he observed the floury chaos covering the counter. "Daddy, look!" Benjamin held up his latest creation, a cookie shaped vaguely like a dog. "It's supposed to be Max." Max was the golden retriever puppy that had joined the household 2 months ago, Eleanor's idea for helping Benjamin learn to trust and care for another living being. "That's perfect," Richard said, and Maria could hear that he meant it. The man who had once demanded perfection from his traumatized son now celebrated every small expression of creativity and joy. Eleanor's voice carried from the foyer as she ended what sounded like another interview call. At 79, she had become an unlikely but formidable advocate for child protection reform, using her social connections and media savvy to push for legislative changes that would make it harder for predators to hide behind institutional respectability. That was CNN. Eleanor announced as she entered the kitchen, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. "The documentary about Dr. Whitmore's network will air next month. They want to interview Benjamin, but I told them absolutely not. The boy has given enough for this cause." Maria nodded approvingly. While Benjamin's courage in speaking out had been crucial to the investigation, Eleanor had been fierce in protecting him from the media circus that followed. The family had given carefully controlled statements through lawyers, but Benjamin himself had been shielded from the public attention that might have re-traumatized him. "What's the latest on the trials?" Richard asked, settling onto a stool beside his son. "Dr. Whitmore's extradition was approved," Eleanor replied grimly. "He'll be back in New York next month to face federal charges. 17 other members of his network have already been arrested." The Vanderberg boys' testimony was particularly compelling. Maria thought about the other families who had found the courage to speak out after the story broke. The network had been larger than anyone initially imagined. Coaches, music instructors, academic tutors, even some boarding school administrators, all connected through a referral system that had operated in plain sight for decades. "Mrs. Eleanor," Benjamin said suddenly, looking up from his cookie-making with serious eyes, "will telling our story help other kids like me?" Eleanor's expression softened as she knelt down to Benjamin's level. "Yes, darling, it already has. Because you were brave enough to trust us with the truth. Lots of other children won't have to go through what you did." Benjamin nodded solemnly, then returned to his baking with the focused determination of someone who understood the weight of his contribution. He had testified via closed-circuit television, with therapists and child advocates ensuring the process was as gentle as possible. But Maria knew the experience had still been difficult for him. The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway drew their attention to the window. Detective Chen was approaching the front door alongside a woman Maria didn't recognize. Tall, blonde, carrying herself with nervous energy. "I'll get it," Richard said. But Eleanor was already moving toward the foyer. Minutes later, they returned with the two women. Detective Chen looked tired but satisfied, the expression of someone who had seen a long investigation reach its conclusion. The blonde woman hung back, her eyes scanning the kitchen with obvious emotion. "Benjamin," Detective Chen said gently, "I'd like you to meet someone special. This is Dr. Amanda Foster. She's been working with some of the other children who went through experiences similar to yours." The woman stepped forward, her smile warm but careful. "Hello, Benjamin. I've heard wonderful things about how brave you've been." Benjamin studied her with the wariness that still surfaced when meeting new adults, but didn't retreat or hide behind Maria as he might have months earlier. "Are you here to ask me more questions?" he asked directly. "No, sweetheart," Dr. Foster replied. "I'm here because I wanted to thank you. You see, I was one of Dr. Whitmore's students too, many years ago when I was about your age. Because you found the courage to speak up, I finally found the courage to tell my story too. The revelation hung in the air like a gift. Here was living proof that survival was possible, that children who endured what Benjamin had experienced could grow up to lead meaningful, successful lives." "Did it help to tell?" Benjamin asked quietly. "It helped tremendously," Dr. Foster said. "And now I work to help other children heal from similar experiences. In a way, you helped make my work possible." Maria watched this exchange with tears in her eyes, marveling at how far they'd all come. The scared, silent child, who had once hidden his drawings in shame, was now capable of direct conversation about his trauma, asking questions that showed both wisdom and healing. "There's something else," Detective Chen said, turning to address the adults. "The investigation has uncovered financial records showing that several charitable organizations were unknowingly laundering money for Dr. Whitmore's network. The amounts involved are substantial, enough to fund a new foundation dedicated to child protection and trauma recovery." Eleanor's eyes lit up with interest. "What kind of foundation?" "One that would train people to recognize signs of institutional abuse, provide resources for families navigating the legal system, and ensure that children from all economic backgrounds have access to proper advocacy," Chen explained. "The irony is that Dr. Whitmore's own ill-gotten gains will now fund efforts to prevent exactly the kind of abuse he perpetrated." As the afternoon wore on and the visitors departed, Maria found herself alone with Benjamin in the garden behind the mansion. He was throwing a tennis ball for Max, the puppy bounding across the perfectly manicured lawn with joyful energy. The scene was so normal, so wonderfully ordinary, that it took Maria's breath away. "Mrs. Maria," Benjamin said, as they sat on a bench watching Max chase butterflies, "do you think my mommy would be proud of me?" The question caught Maria off guard. Benjamin rarely mentioned his mother, and when he did, it was usually in the context of Dr. Whitmore's manipulations about her departure. "I think she would be incredibly proud," Maria said honestly. "You've been through terrible things, and you not only survived them, but helped make sure other children wouldn't have to go through the same thing. That takes a special kind of courage. Benjamin nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes I think she left because she knew something was wrong, but couldn't figure out how to stop it. Like maybe she was trying to protect me the only way she knew how. Maria's heart ached at the wisdom in his words. She had no way of knowing the truth about Catherine Hampton's departure, but she hoped Benjamin's interpretation would help him make peace with that abandonment. Whatever the reason she left, Maria said carefully, it wasn't because of anything you did wrong. And look at you now. You're safe, you're healing, and you're surrounded by people who love you and will protect you. As they headed back toward the house, Maria reflected on her own journey over the past year. The scared, powerless woman who had fled an abusive relationship and taken a job cleaning houses had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. She had learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not by the powerful, but by ordinary people who refused to look away when others were suffering. The Hampton family had offered her a permanent position with a substantial salary increase. Recognizing that she had become far more than hired help, she was part of their family now. The person who had risked everything to save a child who couldn't save himself. But more than that, she had become an advocate. Someone whose experience and instincts were now valued by law enforcement and child protection agencies across the state. That evening, as Maria prepared to leave for her apartment in Hempstead, a much nicer place now, thanks to Eleanor's generosity and her own newfound confidence, Benjamin ran up to her with something in his hands. "I made this for you," he said shyly, holding out a drawing. This picture was completely different from the dark, disturbing images she had first discovered in his wastebasket. This one showed stick figures holding hands in front of a noose, a woman with dark hair labeled Mrs. Maria, a boy with yellow hair labeled me, and two taller figures labeled Daddy and Grandmama. In the corner, a small golden blob was clearly meant to be Max. "We're a family," Benjamin explained unnecessarily, his voice full of the wonder of a child who had learned what safety felt like. Maria knelt down and pulled him into a hug. This brave little boy, who had survived hell and emerged with his capacity for love intact. "Yes, mijo," she whispered into his hair. "We're a family." As she drove home through the gathering dusk, Maria thought about all the children who were sleeping safely tonight because one 7-year-old boy had found the courage to trust an adult with his truth. The network that had operated in shadows for decades was being dismantled piece by piece. Dr. Whitmore would face justice. Other victims were finding their voices. But perhaps most importantly, Benjamin Hampton was learning to be a child again, to laugh, to play, to trust, to hope. His childhood couldn't be given back to him, but his future was bright with possibility. Sometimes, Maria thought, the most powerful victories weren't won in courtrooms or corporate boardrooms. Sometimes they were won in the quiet moments when a traumatized child felt safe enough to laugh, when a broken family found the courage to heal, when ordinary people refused to let evil flourish in silence. The war for Benjamin's soul had been won. The battle for all the other children who needed protection was just beginning. And Maria Gonzalez, former victim turned unlikely warrior, was ready for whatever came next. Please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and if you watched all the way to the end, comment "I watched until the end" and share your thoughts about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's really exciting for those of you who are following along.